What if I told you that everything that you've been led to believe is a lie, and I can tell you the source of the lie and the reason for the lie and who continues to spread the lie and why? If you don't know the information I'm about to share with you, which I'm going to venture to guess that you don't, your mind is about to be blown. So last week, a man named Ian Carroll put out a viral video claiming to have owned Elon Musk with facts and information. Here's the problem. There was not a single fact in what he said, and yet the video went viral. We're going to have to go through these claims individually, and then you're going to understand exactly what's going on by the end of this video. So the first claim he made was that AIPAC is a Jewish lobby group that owns 90% of Congress. This is false. Their campaign contributions of 2024 are about 0.3% of total financial contributions, and you can get that information from Open Secrets. So more importantly, why does he believe this? And where does this thinking come from? It's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, just like all of Ian Carroll's claims that come from Soviet disinformation, or disinformatia, which was the weapon of war during the Cold War that they called the War of Ideas that we are still living in the aftermath of. There are KGB defectors of the secret police of the Soviet Union who testify to this in much greater detail, such as Yuri Bezmenov, such as Mikhail Pasepa. This is an excerpt from Pasepa. Realizing his strong arm against the US methods would no longer work, Stalin turned his thoughts to an old Russian weapon of the emotions that had so successfully been wielded by him and all the Tsars before him: anti-Semitism. Stalin decided to portray the United States as a Zionist realm owned by Jewish money and run by a greedy council of the elders of Zion. Stalin's derisive epithet for the US Congress was militaristic sharks who wanted to transform the rest of the world into a Jewish fiefdom. Hence the claim that Congress is run by Jews. Disinformatia. So the disinformation campaign was essentially that there's a secret council of Jews that run the world with the assistance of the United States. This derives from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now, the Protocols are an epic forgery that were concocted in 1903. That's where it was first disseminated in Imperial Russia. It claimed to be a text written by Jews that planned to take over the world, except it was just a forged document lifted from another material, which was Dialogue in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. Now, at the time, the Russians feared a socialist takeover, and they wanted to blame that takeover on the Jews. So they disseminated this propaganda, which was just an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory with roots in absolutely nothing. But then when the Soviets came to power, they were anti-capitalist, so they flipped the conspiracy to the Jews running the world in secret with the aid of the US in furtherance of a capitalist agenda. Even though it was proved to be a forgery, it was disseminated everywhere and believed by everyone. The name for the operation was Operation Zarathustra. It was disseminated in Germany, where it was read by young children. In the Middle East, it profoundly influenced Hitler. That's where these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories end, just FYI. Next claim by Ian Carroll was that Jews, Muslims, and Christians all lived in peace on the land before the land was sold to the Rothschild and the Jews began their colonial program. Again, this is false. They did not live in peace together on the land. They lived in a system of religious apartheid under colonialist rule. Jews, Christians, and Persian Zoroastrians were dhimmis, which is second-class citizens. They had to pay a tax called the jizya, and if they didn't pay it, they were killed. In Esfahan, they were beheaded. This is from Righteous Victims by Benny Morris. The dhimmi were forbidden to strike a Muslim, carry arms, ride horses, build new houses of worship, or repair old ones, and they had to wear distinctive clothing. This stance was generally mixed with a measure of hostility, especially in times of political crisis. Tolerance was then superseded by intolerance, which occasionally erupted into violence. Throughout, Muslims treated the dhimmi, and perhaps especially the Jews, as impure. Hardly living together in the land in peace, is it? But the question is, why were Jews living as second-class citizens, as dhimmis in their indigenous homeland? The land, Judea, was subject to multiple conquests and colonization. One such conquest was the Muslim conquest of the 7th century. It wasn't just Judea that was colonized, it was all of the Middle East, North Africa, the Levant, even reaching parts of Europe. And these lands were brought together under one system of rule known as the Caliphate. But when the indigenous character of the land was Jewish, why did so many people come to believe that the indigenous character of the land was the Muslim identity when that was the colonial character of the land? Once again, Soviet disinformatia. The Soviets were responsible for conflating Zionism with imperialism. Operation SIG, S-I-G, according to Pasepa, involved the dispatch by the Romanian DIE of approximately 500 undercover agents of influence to Libya, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria. Pasepa describes these operatives as thousands of doctors, engineers, technicians, professors, and even dance instructors who all had the task of portraying the United States as an arrogant and haughty Jewish fiefdom financed by Jewish money and run by Jewish politicians whose aim was to subordinate the entire Islamic world. So what they did is that they riled up the Islamic world, not just the Islamic world, but third world nations against Zionism, conflating Zionism with imperialism. It drew parallels between third world nations and their history of colonization, hitting that emotional target to convince them that this is exactly what the Zionists were doing. Now, how did they turn this around? Jews were being exterminated from everywhere, from Europe, from the Middle East, from North Africa, and so their return to the land was initially framed as a liberation movement. This is from Ernest Bevin, who was the British Foreign Secretary of Mandatory Palestine, and he was actually an anti-Zionist because he believed the establishment of Israel would frustrate the British imperial interest. He said in 1947, His Majesty's government have thus been faced with an irreconcilable conflict of principles. There are in Palestine about 1.2 million Arabs and 600,000 Jews. For the Jews, the essential point of principle is the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. For the Arabs, the essential point of principle is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine. Now you might say, well, they were resisting the establishment of a Jewish state because it was an Arab state. Well, it wasn't. There was no state. There was just the caliphate for 1400 years. And at the collapse of the caliphate during the early 1900s, that's when state building began. That's when all the states were established, from Jordan to Lebanon to Syria to Iraq. And at the same time, they were supposed to erect a Jewish state and an Arab state in Palestine. But here was the problem. The establishment of the Jewish state interfered with Hitler's plan to exterminate the Jews from all over the world. So he collaborated with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, to exterminate Jews on the land as they were arriving in refugee boats and to prevent the Jewish state from ever coming into fruition. But this liberation movement of the Jews was reframed by the Soviets as being an imperialist movement, whereas the intent to destroy the Jewish state, the Soviets taught Yasser Arafat to reframe that instead as a liberation movement. That's why everyone calls Jews white colonizers, because of Soviet disinformatia, whereas Hamas are labeled freedom fighters. Next, Ian Carroll claimed that the groups that founded Israel, Lehi, Irgun, and Haganah, were declared terrorist organizations by Israel itself. Now, to back this claim, Ian Carroll literally cites Wikipedia. No, I'm not kidding. So the context is that when the Jews were arriving on the land from 1920s onwards, they were disenfranchised and they weren't able to protect themselves from the attacks of the Arab militia groups that were slaughtering Jewish villages, notably in the 1929 Hebron massacre. This is from British Police Chief Raymond Cafferata, who testified that on August 23rd, he walked into a room where he saw an Arab in the act of cutting off a Jewish child's head. And behind that child was a woman that was smothered in blood, with a man that he recognized as an Arab police constable standing over the woman with a dagger. The riots reached Tel Aviv and Haifa on August 25th and Safad on August 29th. Jews of their villages were being slaughtered by thousands of Arab militias. The Yishuv, which were the Jewish community of the land, were shocked by the Brits' failure to protect. Benny Morris writes that the result of the Hebron massacre was the Yishuv realized that they needed a powerful militia. That's when some of the Haganah officers branched off to create a breakaway group, Irgun, and then later Lehi. But the main military force was Haganah, and that was not an offensive force, it was a defensive force. Now, putting this into perspective doesn't make any terrorism committed by any of these breakaway groups acceptable, and that's indeed why it was condemned. But it's kind of a different context to the way that Ian Carroll framed it to you from Wikipedia. Next, Ian Carroll writes that Israel is a foreign nation halfway across the world that has no business receiving my tax dollars. Why are we sending them billions of dollars of our tax money? First of all, that money was about 0.06% of the 2024 federal budget, and it is for your national security. You see, there's something called Islamism, which is political Islam, rather than spiritual Islam, which is practiced by most Muslims. The goal of Islamism is to re-establish an Islamic state or caliphate and then eventually destroy the West. The existence of Israel frustrates an Islamic hegemony in the region. Islamists want to destroy the Muslim states and the sole Jewish state and then come for you. The US funds Israel to fight the terrorists so that the terrorists don't eventually get to you. The United States doesn't do anything except for its own benefit. What did you think it was sending the money for? Just like it funds Ukraine to prevent the growing influence of the Kremlin, again, to protect you. The people that disseminate this Soviet disinformation propaganda think that they're being pro-US, but they aren't benefiting anybody except the Kremlin and its efforts to undermine the US. The goal is to confuse you, and this is exactly what defector Yuri Bezmenov described would happen in a state of ideological subversion, to pump so much disinformation into a society that you lose the ability to discern between truth and fiction. Then you become demoralized. And a demoralized society is vulnerable to hostile influences. So everything about the way that you see things comes from Soviet disinformation, Soviet programming that was designed to make you see things in this way so that you become more favorable to socialism, to communism, so that they could extend their influence, which is quite literally the definition of imperialism that they were masking as anti-imperialism. That's why our society is upside down, because everything we believe is based on disinformatia.